There are stories in Rome's history that the marble walls never spoke of, secrets buried beneath the grandeur of temples and the echo of prayers. Among them lies the tale of the Vestal Virgins, the sacred women sworn to protect the eternal flame of the goddess Vesta. To the people, they were symbols of divine purity. But behind those stone sanctuaries, purity became a prison and holiness a weapon. What the Roman priests did within those sanctified chambers was worse than death itself. This is not myth or rumor, but the dark anatomy of power, faith, and sin, a history Rome tried to silence, but the earth refused to forget. In the marble heart of ancient Rome, where the Senate ruled by decree and emperors cloaked tyranny in divine authority, there stood a temple unlike any other. The Temple of Vesta, small yet eternal, held within it the flame said to guard the life of the empire itself. As long as that fire burned, Rome would endure. And to protect it, 6 chosen maidens, the Vestal Virgins, surrendered their childhood, their freedom, and their very identities to the goddess. They were selected between the ages of 6 and 10, drawn from noble families, and sworn to 30 years of chastity. To the Roman people, they were living symbols of the city's moral perfection, embodiments of the goddess's eternal virginity. To serve as a Vestal was the highest honor a woman could receive, yet it was also a sentence that bound body and soul. Each morning, the temple courtyard filled with the scent of ash and incense. White-robed figures moved silently across marble floors, tending to the sacred flame while the city roared beyond the temple walls. The world outside saw serenity. Inside, discipline ruled. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, oversaw every breath, every movement, ensuring no impurity tainted the goddess's domain. Yet beneath that order lingered unease. The flame demanded more than devotion. It demanded submission. The young Vestals learned quickly that holiness was not freedom, but surveillance. Their laughter was forbidden, their tears seen as weakness, their bodies inspected for any sign of corruption. Even dreams, if confessed, could be used as evidence of sin. They were to belong not to themselves, but to Rome, to the goddess, to the priests, to the state. Beneath the temple's white perfection hid another truth. The Vestals were living instruments of power. Their chastity was Rome's pride, and any hint of scandal could shake the empire's faith. The priests who controlled them wielded this power like a weapon. When a Vestal smiled too freely at a senator's son, when her eyes lingered too long upon a soldier, even rumor could destroy her. And destruction in the Temple of Vesta was ritualized. The punishment for impurity was burial alive. Rome would not spill a Vestal's blood. Instead, she would be entombed beneath the earth, given a lamp, bread, and water, left to suffocate in sacred darkness. To the people, this act was seen as divine justice. But to those within the temple, it was a message. Obedience was survival. In public, the priests spoke of virtue and divine protection. In private, their power grew unchecked. The temple's high walls concealed more than prayers. They hid whispers, punishments, and quiet fear. For beneath Rome's obsession with purity lay the same corruption that stained its emperors and generals, the hunger to control what was never theirs to touch. As centuries turned, the sacred flame never faltered, but neither did the darkness gathering beneath its glow. Within that temple, faith had become theater, and innocence its sacrifice. The people bowed to purity. The priests hid their sins behind it. And in that silence, one truth burned brighter than the sacred flame itself, that holiness, when wielded by power, can become the cruelest prison of all. Every spring, beneath the shadow of the Capitoline Hill, Rome's noblest families gathered for the selection of the virgins, a ceremony draped in piety but driven by ambition. Fathers dressed their daughters in linen, their hair oiled and braided like offerings. They whispered prayers not for their child's happiness, but for their family's legacy. To be chosen by the goddess meant honor, tax exemption, divine favor. Yet none spoke of what the chosen would lose. The Pontifex Maximus, towering in crimson robes, moved through the line of trembling girls. His gaze, austere and godlike, passed over faces pale with dread. Each girl's name was called, then struck from her family record, a symbolic death. Mothers wept softly while senators applauded. The selected children were led away, their small hands clutching at the air where their parents once stood. From that moment, they ceased to belong to blood or kin. They were the property of Vesta. Inside the temple compound, their transformation began. The Adicue, elder Vestals hardened by years of silence, stripped the novices of jewels, ribbons, even childhood trinkets. They cut their hair, each lock burned in the sacred fire as proof that mortal vanity had been sacrificed. The girls were renamed with new identities, purified by loss. Every gesture, every movement was retrained. They learned to walk without sound, to speak only when commanded, to smile without warmth. The novices slept in narrow stone chambers, beneath ceilings painted with stars they could never touch. At dawn, they scrubbed marble floors until their fingers bled, then recited hymns until their voices faded to whispers. The temple was not a sanctuary, but an education in submission. Their instructors spoke of divine duty, yet behind their words pulsed a darker truth. The perfection of obedience created perfect instruments. Each day brought inspection. The priests examined their posture, their garments, their skin for blemishes. Purity was measured not in virtue, but in visibility. The pontifex himself occasionally attended these rituals, claiming that his eyes safeguarded Rome's holiness. His gaze lingered too long. None dared speak of it. Outside the temple gates, life continued. Lovers quarreled in markets, soldiers marched through the forum, senators plotted over wine. But for the Vestals, time dissolved. The goddess's service demanded 30 years, 10 of training, 10 of tending the flame, 10 of teaching the next captives. Freedom came only with age, if at all. Few survived long enough to taste it. Yet, amid this machinery of devotion, one novice watched with awakening clarity. Aaliyah, daughter of the senator Lucius Varro, had entered the order at 7. She was quiet, dutiful, unseen. But each night, as she knelt before the eternal flame, she wondered whether the goddess truly required so much pain. The priests spoke of purity, yet she saw hunger in their eyes when they addressed the elder Vestals. She began to question whether the sacred fire burned for Vesta, or for the power of men who claimed to serve her. Her questions, though silent, would soon find their echo. Whispers spread in the dormitories, of doubts, of forbidden thoughts, of girls who dreamed of the world beyond the walls. The temple that called itself eternal was already cracking from within. Outside, Rome's empire expanded in blood and conquest. Inside, another empire, smaller, hidden, ruled through fear and faith. And in that unseen empire, innocence had become both weapon and offering. For Aaliyah and her sisters, the vow of chastity was no longer a bond with the divine. It was the chain that would decide who lived and who would be buried alive. When Emperor Domitian rose to power in 81 AD, Rome trembled under a ruler who worshipped control as others worshipped gods. He called himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and demanded purity from his empire as if morality itself were an instrument of his reign. The sacred orders, especially that of the Vestal Virgins, became mirrors through which he measured Rome's virtue. But in that mirror, his reflection was far darker than any would dare to name aloud. Domitian claimed to be the guardian of divine order. He ordered new inspections of the Vestals, decreed stricter vows, and built an additional sanctum near the temple, a private chamber reserved, he said, for spiritual contemplation. Yet soon the whispers began. The emperor attended the nightly rituals, not as emperor, but as a silent devotee, cloaked in plain white, his presence unseen but felt. Even the flame seemed to flicker under his gaze. The people praised his reforms, hailing him as a restorer of Rome's morality. But inside the temple walls, fear deepened. The Pontifex Maximus, eager to please his emperor, tightened his authority. The novices no longer dared look upward. Any gesture, any pause in prayer, might be misread as rebellion. And though Domitian never officially entered the Virgins' quarters, the corridors carried tales that chilled the servants to silence. At times, the emperor summoned the elder Vestals to the palace under the pretext of council. They were escorted through marble corridors lined with statues of gods, and of Domitian himself. Witnesses described how they returned pale, trembling, their lips sealed. One, an older priestess named Cornelia, vanished entirely. The next day, her name was erased from the temple records, her chamber sealed. The priest said she had broken her vows and been buried alive, but no public execution was held. Rome's citizens wondered, had the emperor himself delivered her judgment? Among the younger Vestals, Aelia began to see what others feared to acknowledge. She noticed how the pontifex's tone changed whenever Domitian visited, how offerings increased, how silence became a currency of survival. The goddess's service, once sacred, now reeked of politics and lust disguised as sanctity. At the evening sacrifices, the emperor's eyes lingered too long upon the white-veiled figures kneeling before him. And when he smiled, it was not the smile of a ruler guided by divine piety, but of a man who had found in religion a mask for desire. The city outside sang hymns to his virtue, but Rome's virtue was rotting. The empire expanded through cruelty. Its emperor fed upon fear, and its holiest order was becoming his personal theater of judgment. The boundary between God and man, priest and sinner, had dissolved, and in that dissolution, the flame of Vesta flickered more violently than ever before. Late one night, as Aelia tended the sacred fire, she felt a presence watching. The courtyard was empty, yet the hairs on her neck rose. A single step echoed behind her, and a whisper faint, almost prayerful, brushed her ear. The goddess sees everything. When she turned, no one stood there. But from the shadows near the colonnade, a figure withdrew, a man in imperial white. By dawn, Aelia no longer believed that holiness protected them. She understood now that in Rome, purity did not shield the innocent. It invited the gaze of power. And that gaze, once fixed upon them, would never look away. By the winter of 89 AD, the temple had grown quieter, heavier. The hymns of devotion had thinned into murmurs of fear. Each step across the marble floor echoed like a warning. Each glance exchanged between the Vestals held unspoken terror. Even the sacred flame seemed to burn colder, its light unable to pierce the darkness creeping through the temple's heart. For Aelia, the silence had become unbearable. She had learned to kneel, to bow, to speak only the words the priests demanded. But her mind, once obedient, now trembled with questions. She had seen the emperor's visits cloaked in secrecy, the pontifex's trembling servitude, the vanishing of elder sisters whose purity had supposedly faltered. Yet none spoke of what truly occurred beyond those sealed doors. Every disappearance was wrapped in ritual, justified by faith. But Aelia began to sense that Rome's gods were not the ones demanding blood. Among the younger novices, quiet rebellion took root. In their stone quarters, as the moonlight slipped through narrow slits in the walls, whispers replaced prayers. Some spoke of running away, others of confessing imagined sins to end their suffering. To doubt the goddess was heresy. To speak it aloud was suicide. Yet the weight of secrecy pressed on them like a tomb. One night, when the city outside was drowned in rain and thunder, Aelia found herself alone in the atrium of the temple. The flame wavered in the storm's breath, casting long shadows across the marble. She fell to her knees, tears cutting through ash on her cheeks. For the first time, she dared whisper into the void. If the goddess is pure, why does she allow such filth in her name? A sound stirred behind her, the soft rustle of robes. Startled, Aelia turned and met the eyes of the high priest, his expression unreadable. He said nothing for a long moment. only studied her trembling form as though weighing her soul. Then, with a voice low and deliberate, he asked, "Did you speak?" Elia tried to deny it, but her voice betrayed her. She confessed not to blasphemy, but to confusion, to doubt. The priest listened in silence, then placed a cold hand upon her shoulder. "The goddess hears all," he murmured. "And doubt is the seed of corruption." By dawn, word of Elia's confession spread through the temple like a curse. The gates were sealed. The priests declared a ritual of purification. Every vestal was questioned, examined, isolated. The novices were forbidden to speak, the elder sisters forced to renew their vows before the Pontifex Maximus himself. The temple's air thickened with dread. Elia's own words, twisted, exaggerated, reshaped by the priests, became evidence of impurity. They claimed she had spoken of love, of a man, of forbidden contact. Witnesses were invented, testimony forged. It no longer mattered what she had said. What mattered was what they could make it mean. That night, Elia was taken to the lower chambers beneath the temple, a place where the light of the sacred flame never reached. As the heavy doors closed, she understood her confession had not cleansed her. It had condemned her. Above, the storm raged on. Rome slept, believing its goddess guarded purity eternal. But beneath those marble floors, the priests had kindled another kind of fire, one that devoured innocence and called it divine. And as Elia's cries echoed in the hollow dark, the city of Rome unknowingly prepared for its next spectacle, the holy punishment of those who dared to doubt. Morning broke over Rome like a wound reopening, crimson light bleeding through clouds, spilling across the marble facades of temples and courts. Word had spread swiftly, a Vestal Virgin had fallen. The city buzzed with both horror and anticipation. For nothing fed Rome's appetite more than a scandal dressed in sanctity. In the Forum, preparations began before sunrise. Magistrates gathered, priests assembled, and soldiers formed ranks along the sacred route leading to the tribunal. The accusation was grave: Elia of the Temple of Vesta, charged with impurity, the most unforgivable sin a Vestal could commit. The punishment was ancient: she would be buried alive. The ritual, they claimed, was not murder, but sacrifice. Within the temple, Elia sat shackled to her own silence. Her hair, once veiled in white, now hung loose and heavy. She had not spoken since her capture. Every word had been stolen from her mouth and rewritten by men who worshipped power. The high priest, standing before her, rehearsed the sacred decree, his voice trembling more with politics than piety. "The goddess demands purity," he declared. "One corrupted flame endangers all Rome." Outside, crowds gathered, their faces painted with fascination and fear. The same citizens who once threw flowers at the Vestal's feet now watched for the fall of one. Mothers held their daughters close. Men whispered prayers they did not mean. And through the chaos, the emperor's chariot arrived, Domitian himself, cloaked in white and gold, his eyes burning with the calm cruelty of a god made flesh. The tribunal began at noon. Elia was led into the open courtyard, her bare feet dragging through dust. Before her stood the Pontifex Maximus, flanked by imperial guards. Witnesses spoke, priests, attendants, even a trembling novice coerced into false confession. Their words painted her as a seductress, a betrayer of divine trust. But beneath the rhetoric, every listener felt the deeper truth. This was not justice. It was theater. When given the chance to speak, Elia lifted her head. Her voice, fragile yet fierce, broke the silence. "If purity means silence before evil, then we are all defiled." A murmur rippled through the crowd, shock, awe, terror. The Pontifex struck his staff to the ground. "Blasphemy," he thundered. "The sentence is sealed." By dusk, a procession wound its way to the Campus Celeratus, the field of the accursed. The air was thick with incense and dread. A pit had been prepared, a narrow chamber lined with stone, furnished with oil, a lamp, and bread, the illusion of mercy. Ilia was lowered inside, her wrists bound, her gaze fixed on the sliver of sky above. As the final slab of earth was drawn over her, she whispered not a prayer, but a curse upon those who wore holiness like armor, and upon the empire that demanded women die for its sins. When the last stone sealed the chamber, Rome roared in approval. But beneath their applause lay something uneasy, a tremor, a guilt no ritual could cleanse. For the sacred flame that burned in Vesta's temple flickered that night, as if mourning one who had carried its light more faithfully than the priests who condemned her. And though Domitian returned to his palace victorious, the whispers would not die. Some said that in the quiet hours before dawn, the goddess herself wept, and that her tears hissed upon the sacred fire. The Temple of Vesta stood silent that night, its sacred flame wavering like a heartbeat caught between guilt and divinity. The city above slept, believing purity still reigned within those marble walls. But beneath, in the torchlit chambers few ever entered, the true blasphemy unfolded. Behind the goddess's altar, a narrow passage led to the adytum, a forbidden sanctum known only to the priests. There, the sacred rituals of purification took place. The air reeked of incense and oil, the heavy scent meant to drown out the stench of fear. The priests whispered that the goddess demanded suffering for renewal, that pain was a path to divine rebirth. And so, under the mask of faith, they turned sanctity into sin. Each ceremony began the same way, hymns echoing through the marble, the flicker of oil lamps casting halos upon trembling faces. The chosen Vestal, sometimes a novice, sometimes one condemned for imagined impurity, was led into the chamber. Stripped of her veil, anointed with oil, and told she would be made clean. They told her not to resist, for resistance was rebellion against the goddess. What followed was neither ritual nor redemption, but desecration disguised as prayer. The high priest presided, his tone reverent as he murmured ancient verses. To the onlookers, the younger priests sworn to obedience, he framed the acts as sacred duty, a sacrifice of flesh for the preservation of Rome's spiritual order. They believed, or pretended to. Power had made them blind, desire had made them deaf. The goddess was silent, and so they claimed her silence as approval. In those moments, the temple's walls seemed to breathe, groaning beneath the weight of hypocrisy. The marble statues of Vesta watched in frozen stillness, their eyes carved in serenity while their sanctuary became a chamber of corruption. The screams of the violated were muffled beneath hymns, their tears absorbed by the same stone that once bore prayers. When the rites ended, the women were left trembling, covered in sacred oil, their voices broken into whispers. The priests called them reborn. But as seasons passed, the flame at the heart of the temple began to falter. It sputtered unpredictably, its light dimming during prayers. Servants whispered that the goddess no longer answered. The senior priests dismissed it as wind, yet unease crept through even their arrogance. For every ritual they performed, the flame seemed to burn weaker, as if consuming the very souls of those who had once guarded it. Among the Vestals, fear turned to despair. The sisterhood that once sang hymns of devotion now walked the halls in silence, haunted by what had been done in the name of holiness. One among them, Marsa, began to write her thoughts in secret, carving words into fragments of clay hidden beneath her bedding. If this is purity, then Rome's gods are dead. The priests never discovered her markings. They were too drunk on power, too certain of divine favor. But the corruption had begun to rot the roots of their temple. Even the emperor's messengers reported strange omens, doves falling dead near the altar, water turning to ash. Still, the priests continued. For in their eyes, sin was not what they committed, it was what they controlled. They believed the goddess would forgive all, so long as her flame endured. But soon, even the fire would turn against them. The sentence was declared beneath a sky the color of rust. Rome gathered in silence, the air thick with incense and hypocrisy. The Pontifex Maximus stood before the Senate, robes gleaming white as snow, voice steady as marble. His verdict fell like thunder. The Vestal Virgins had broken their sacred vow. No trial was needed. No evidence demanded. The gods, he said, had already spoken through the trembling of the sacred flame. The people watched with bowed heads, too afraid to question, too conditioned to believe. For centuries, they had been told that the purity of Rome itself rested upon the chastity of these women. If the flame dimmed, it was the virgins' fault. If the earth quaked, the gods demanded their blood. None dared whisper that it was the priest's own corruption that had darkened the goddess's fire. Elias stood among the condemned, young, hollow-eyed, her white veil soaked in tears. Her crime was not desire, but defiance. She had spoken of the pain, of the rituals, of the lies whispered beneath the altar. And for that truth, Rome decreed she must die. With her were two others, sisters in both service and suffering, their faces pale beneath the torchlight. They were told their deaths would restore Rome's sanctity. At dawn, the condemned were led beyond the city walls to a desolate field known as the Campus Celeratus, the field of the accursed. It was a place forbidden to the living, where grass refused to grow and even birds avoided the air above it. A pit had been dug, deep, narrow, waiting like the open mouth of the underworld. Inside lay a small chamber, furnished mockingly with a bed, a lamp, a loaf of bread, and a jug of milk. The Romans called it mercy, a burial with life still clinging. The ritual began with solemn procession. Musicians played dirges too soft to mask the weeping. The high priest recited prayers of purity while the condemned were stripped of their veils and ornaments, the symbols of the goddess they once served. Their veils were cast into the pit first, as if the goddess herself had rejected them. When Aaliyah reached the edge, she turned her gaze upward. She did not beg nor curse, but spoke softly. If the goddess sees truth, she will not forget. The priest beside her flinched, fearing blasphemy. Yet the crowd murmured, something in her voice carried beyond fear. Then the rope descended. One by one, the women were lowered into the pit, their white robes glowing faintly against the blackness below. When the last one disappeared, the priest sealed the entrance with stones and soil. The ground trembled as the first shovelfuls fell, a slow suffocation of innocence beneath Rome's feet. As the final stone was placed, the Pontifex raised his hands and declared purity restored. The crowd bowed, but among them, a few turned away, unable to watch. They said the earth shifted as if resisting the weight of its new tomb. That night, thunder rolled across the city, though no storm came. The priests feasted in the temple that evening, praising Vesta for mercy, their lips still stained with sacrificial wine. Yet beneath the soil of the Campus Celeratus, the last flicker of a lamp burned beside three lifeless bodies, and Rome's sacred fire, for the first time in generations, wavered as if gasping for air. The virgins were buried, but the guilt was not. In the weeks that followed the burial, Rome's streets grew uneasy. The air hung heavy, as if the city itself held its breath. The priests proclaimed victory, purity restored, the goddess appeased. But the sacred flame told another story. Its light flickered erratically, shrinking in the windless air, as though the fire feared to burn. Then the whispers began. At first, it was the night guards who heard them, faint cries rising from beneath the streets, near the Campus Celeratus. They dismissed them as tricks of wind through ancient catacombs. But soon, merchants closing their stalls after dusk swore they heard voices, soft, pleading, like prayers turned to lamentations. "Forgive us," the whispers said. "See us." The priests forbade mention of it, calling it heresy. Yet even they could not sleep without dreams of hands clawing through stone. Within the temple, strange things began to occur. The sacred oil spoiled overnight. Statues wept dark streaks of condensation, as though mourning the dead. Lamps extinguished themselves in mid-prayer. The younger Vestals grew pale and silent, refusing to enter the inner sanctum after sunset. They claimed they felt breath on their necks, cold human, whispering from nowhere. When one priest was found dead near the altar, his face contorted in terror, the temple's walls seemed to close in around the living. His body was discovered sprawled beneath the flames basin, his eyes wide and dry, his mouth frozen mid-scream. No wound, no mark. The pontifex declared it a divine punishment for doubt, but the others knew it was not the gods they feared now. It was the buried. Rumors spread through the city like infection. Some said they saw pale shapes drifting through the forum at night. Others claimed the ground near the field of the accursed pulsed, as if something beneath struggled to rise. Mothers forbade their children from playing near the old walls. Even the emperor's messengers avoided the temple at dusk, muttering that the goddess had turned her face away. Elia's name was never spoken, yet her presence was felt. The people began leaving offerings of flowers at the edge of the Campus Celeratus, not for Vesta, but for the women buried alive. A dangerous act, one whispered in shadows. To pity the condemned was to defy the priests. But the people's fear of divine wrath was slowly replaced by guilt. The pontifex ordered new rituals of cleansing. More incense, more sacrifices, more blood. Yet with every chant, the temple grew colder. The sound of cracking stone echoed through the halls at night, though no damage could be found by morning. The priests spoke of earthquakes, but Rome's scholars noted none recorded, as if the tremors existed only within the temple walls. One night, a Vestal awoke screaming. She claimed she saw Elia's face reflected in the flame, not burning but breathing, her lips moving in silence. When they relit the torches, the flame shrank again, a faint pulse of red deep within the ashes. The goddess's fire was dying, and with it, Rome's illusion of purity. In the silence that followed, even the priests began to fear prayer itself. For every word they spoke echoed back, not as blessing, but as whisper. And the whisper called their names. By the turning of the next moon, the temple had become a house of dread. The sacred flame, once Rome's living heartbeat, sputtered weakly, its glow no longer golden but red, like a wound refusing to heal. The priests called it an omen, though none could agree whose wrath it foretold. Some whispered that Vesta demanded greater sacrifice. Others feared the cries beneath the earth had reached her throne. The Pontifex Maximus declared a midnight ritual of purification, a ceremony so secret that only the highest priests could attend. They would cleanse the temple, he said, through blood and devotion. The order was absolute, silence upon pain of death. But Rome had learned by now that silence often concealed sin. At midnight, under a sky bruised with storm clouds, the priests gathered before the altar. The torches burned dimly, casting the marble statues in monstrous shapes. Animals, lambs, goats, even a pure white bull were brought forth as offerings. The pontifex raised his voice in chant, calling upon the goddess to restore Rome's purity. The knives flashed in sacred rhythm. Blood poured across the marble floor, running like red threads toward the dying flame. Yet the fire did not strengthen. It hissed, sputtered, and recoiled as though rejecting the offering. The priests faltered, fear creeping into their voices. Some said they heard another sound, not the chant, not the wind, but a woman sobbing, echoing faintly through the temple's hollow corridors. Hidden among the shadows stood one who was not meant to be there, Marcia, the last surviving Vestal. She had witnessed too much, endured too long. Her veil had been torn, her faith mutilated, yet her spirit clung to one truth. The goddess was not blind, and she was not silent. As the priests continued their ritual, Marcia stepped forward. Her voice trembled but did not waver. "You spill blood for the goddess," she said. "But it is your own she demands." Her words cut through the chanting like a blade. The priests froze. One lunged to silence her, but she pointed toward the altar. toward the flame that had begun to convulse, flaring violently, as if breathing in rage. The pontifex shouted prayers, but the words dissolved into chaos. The blood upon the altar began to boil. The torches flickered and died, leaving only the central flame, burning now the color of blackened iron. Shadows twisted across the walls, and within them, faces seemed to form. Pale, hollow-eyed, their mouths moving in soundless accusation. The priests fell to their knees, crying that the goddess was testing them. But Marcia's voice rose above the storm. "She turns away from you, because you have defiled what was hers." Then, with a violent gasp, the sacred flame went out. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy, suffocating, eternal. The temple that had guarded Rome's heart stood in utter darkness. The blood on the floor cooled to rust. The priests trembled, staring at the cold altar, unable to speak. Outside, thunder cracked over the city. Some said lightning struck the field of the accursed that night, splitting the earth. Others claimed they heard voices, soft, mournful, rising from below the ground. And in that black silence, one truth settled over Rome like ash: the goddess had abandoned them. When news reached the imperial palace that the sacred flame had died, Emperor Domitian locked himself within his private chambers for 3 days. The keepers of the temple trembled, knowing the goddess's silence could be read as rebellion, and rebellion against the gods was treason against the emperor himself. But Domitian, already haunted by paranoia, saw more than divine anger. He saw ghosts. Those closest to him reported that the emperor no longer slept. He would wake in the night shouting that the walls were whispering, that pale hands reached for him from beneath the marble floors. Servants found him wandering the corridors of the Palatine Hill, muttering prayers to a goddess he once claimed to control. His reflection, he said, followed him even in the dark. The priests, desperate to appease him, brought false assurances. They claimed the flame could be reignited with a single act of repentance, another ritual, another sacrifice. But Domitian no longer trusted their faith. He accused them of treachery, of poisoning Rome's divine favor with impurity. He ordered them to fast for 7 days, to flog themselves in repentance. The sound of lashes echoed from the temple for hours, mingled with hymns that had lost their rhythm. And still, the emperor's nightmares grew. He spoke of 3 women standing at the edge of his bed, faces white as marble, eyes hollow, lips moving without sound. "They call me by name," he whispered to his attendants. "They ask why I buried the innocent." Outside the palace, omens multiplied. Statues bled from their eyes. Crows gathered upon the forum in unnatural silence. A flock of doves released during a public ceremony fell dead mid-flight before the crowd. Rome murmured that Vesta's vengeance had taken form. The priests called it coincidence, but no one believed them anymore. As hysteria spread, the emperor's punishments grew crueler. He commanded that the remaining Vestals be confined within the temple, deprived of light until the goddess relented. He ordered the priests to continue their fasts until delirium, claiming that only through suffering could purity return. Those who faltered were beaten in the streets. Those who questioned were silenced. Within weeks, the Temple of Purity had become a prison of decay. The marble floors cracked from neglect, the altars stained black with old blood. Even the air inside the sanctum smelled of rot. The few surviving Vestals, frail and hollow-eyed, whispered prayers not for forgiveness, but for death. Domitian's mind, once sharp and disciplined, fractured completely. He refused counsel, accusing senators and generals alike of conspiracy. "Even the gods have betrayed me," he declared. "But I will make them remember who rules Rome." His words spread like infection through the empire, proof that madness had claimed the throne. One night, the emperor summoned his guards and ordered them to dig beneath the temple floor, claiming the voices of the dead were hiding there. When they refused, he seized a torch himself and descended into the dark chambers below. By dawn, he emerged pale, trembling, his torch extinguished. He said nothing, only that the goddess had spoken and she would take what was hers. That morning, the palace servants heard him laughing alone. By nightfall, his laughter turned to screams. Rome had lost its god, and now it was losing its emperor. In the year 96 AD, as autumn fell upon Rome, the sacred flame that had burned for centuries, the heart of the empire's purity, died in silence. No wind touched it, no hand extinguished it. It simply withered into smoke, as though the goddess herself had turned her gaze away. When the priests discovered the cold ashes at dawn, they fell to their knees, unable to speak. Even the birds above the temple ceased their morning song. News of the extinguished flame reached Emperor Domitian within the hour. Witnesses said, "He stared at the messenger for a long moment, his face void of expression, then whispered, 'So it ends.'" That same day, he dismissed his council and locked the palace gates. The empire's most powerful man sat alone, surrounded by the echoes of his own decrees, muttering to the air as if bargaining with unseen judges. Outside the palace, fear consumed the city. Markets emptied, temples closed, and citizens whispered prayers not to the gods, but to the dead Vestals, whose voices they believed still haunted the Campus Celeratus. The clergy tried to relight the sacred flame, but every torch sputtered out before it touched the altar. Even fire itself refused to obey. Domitian's nightmares returned with violence. Servants heard him raging through the night, screaming that the earth beneath the palace was hollow, that someone was moving in the dark below his feet. He ordered guards to dig through the floors, searching for the bones of the damned. When they found nothing, he accused them of treason. Within days, the corridors of the Palatine stank of blood and fear. Rome had seen madness before, in Caligula, in Nero, but this was different. Domitian's cruelty was not spectacle. It was penance. He flogged his own body before the household gods, crying that he had betrayed the flame. He decreed that no one should speak the name Vesta aloud, claiming her silence was punishment enough. Then came the storm. A violent wind tore through the city one night, toppling statues and breaking temple doors. Lightning struck the Temple of Vesta, shattering its roof. In the morning, when the priests entered the ruins, they found the altar blackened and the goddess's statue split clean through, half fallen into shadow. For many, that was the sign Rome's covenant with its gods was broken forever. Within days, the conspiracy began. Senators whispered that the emperor's divine protection had ended. His own guards turned cold in their loyalty. On September 18th, 96 AD, Domitian was found dead in his chambers, stabbed beneath a torn tapestry depicting the goddess he had failed. Blood pooled beneath the image of Vesta, seeping into the cracks of the marble floor. The temple was sealed that same evening. No prayers were said, no hymns were sung. The remaining Vestals were dismissed quietly, their vows dissolved under imperial decree. The flame that had once symbolized Rome's eternal spirit was now nothing but soot and silence. For weeks, the city lay in uneasy calm. The people whispered that the goddess had taken her vengeance, not only on the priests, but on the emperor who allowed their blasphemy. Yet, beneath that calm lingered something deeper: guilt. The empire had watched innocents buried alive and called it justice. Now the gods had answered. Years later, poets would write that on the night Domitian died, the moon over Rome turned red, as if the heavens themselves mourned the end of the flame. But others said it was not mourning, it was warning. Because even when the fire dies, its smoke still remembers. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Faiths were born and forgotten, but beneath Rome, the earth kept its silence. The Temple of Vesta decayed into ruin, its marble cracked and its sacred hearth buried under dust. Crowds now walked the streets above, never knowing that beneath their feet slept the secret sin of Rome. In the late 19th century, during excavations in the Romang Forum, workers uncovered a sealed stone vault beneath what was once the temple's outer chamber. Its doorway bore a faint Latin carving, De Tacita, to the silent goddess. When the archaeologists opened it, a rush of stale air met them, dry, ancient, heavy as if the earth itself exhaled guilt. Inside, they found a cluster of small human skeletons, bound in ritual linen. The bones were fragile, unmistakably those of young women. A clay lamp rested beside one skull, its flame long dead. Etched faintly at its base were words that chilled the room. She was holy until they touched her. The find spread through Rome like a curse reborn. Newspapers called it the sin beneath the city. Crowds gathered at the dig site, leaving flowers for women whose names had vanished from record. Historians argued whether this was symbolic, a later act of atonement, or something far older. Some whispered that these were the condemned Vestals themselves, the ones buried alive in the field of the accursed. The church remained silent, the state ordered secrecy. But one scholar, Livia Montani, refused to look away. Studying the records of Domitian's reign, she uncovered fragments of temple logs, mostly burned. Yet one line survived: Alia, condemned for the impurity of others. That single phrase consumed her. Comparing ancient maps, Montani realized the Campus Celeratus, where impure Vestals had been buried alive, a line directly beneath the excavation site. The pit of their execution lay not beside the temple, but beneath it. Rome had built its holiest shrine atop the graves of its own martyrs. Her report concluded, the empire buried its guilt with its victims, but the earth does not forget. The silence beneath Rome is not absence, it is memory. The publication caused quiet panic. Within weeks, Vatican officials sealed the vault for preservation. Montani was dismissed from her post. She died years later, whispering that she could still hear them, faint voices beneath the city, murmuring prayers or curses she could not tell which. Those who entered the vault spoke of unease that lingered in their dreams. One claimed he heard the flicker of unseen fire. Another swore he felt breath on his neck, though the chamber held no air. The site was soon buried again, fenced off, and forgotten by the living. Today, tourists stroll across the forum, taking photographs where the sacred flame once burned. They see ruins, columns, and stone. But beneath them, untouched for millennia, the bones of the silent Vestal still rest in their linen shrouds. The clay lamp remains by Alia's skull, a symbol of purity defiled. And as the documentary closes, the camera lingers on the ruins at dusk, the setting sun casting a crimson glow across the temple stones. They said the flame of Vesta would burn forever. Perhaps it still does, not in fire, but in the memory of those who died to keep it pure.